They would not stop. They simply would not stop. I don't know, 15, 16, 17, 18 minutes. I don't remember how long it was. I only remember that I couldn't stop crying.
It didn't surprise me that they would not let him speak, not let him, not let go of him. He was the representation of what they had lost. And if the delegates had a sense of loss, imagine what his feelings were. Every day, every hour, every minute, he felt the loss of his brother.
10 months before, President John Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. Robert Kennedy had given his life to his brother as confidant, protector, lightning rod. Now his brother was gone, and he was left to carry on alone.
He was not really built for the spotlight. He was built for the wings. He had to fight against a basic shyness, a basic nervousness in public. Many times I would stand behind the stage and I would see his leg shaking during a speech or his hand shaking. He wasn't unnatural. But that all had to change when his brother was assassinated. And I think change is the motif of his whole life and career.
He really becomes something much larger than what he was when he began. He becomes stronger through suffering.
The applause went on for 22 long minutes. As the crowd grew quiet, he commemorated his brother in words from Romeo and Juliet.
When I think of President Kennedy, I think of what Shakespeare said in Romeo and Juliet, when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he shall make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun.
In the spring of 1952, Massachusetts Congressman John Kennedy was keeping up a brave face while his campaign for the United States Senate descended into chaos. He desperately needed someone to manage his campaign. He chose his younger brother Robert. Robert Kennedy didn't want the job. He was busy working as a lawyer in the Justice Department. But he knew what his family expected of him. For the next 12 years, he devoted himself to his brother's ambitions. This was what he had done as a child. Robert Kennedy was the third boy and the seventh of 9 children. He was born in Brookline, Massachusetts on November 20, 1925. Simply keeping up absorbed his energies.
Everything was a competition, within the family and without. They still talk, this little yacht club in Hyannis, about how the Kennedys cheated by adding more sailcloth to their boats. The Kennedys were very competitive and they wanted to win at everything they did.
We don't want any losers around here, Joseph Kennedy told all his children. In this family, we want winners. Don't come in second or third. That doesn't count. Win. Joseph P. Kennedy had made millions with shrewd investments in the stock market, the movies, and in bootleg spirits. He wanted more out of life than money. He wanted his two oldest sons, Joe Jr. and Jack, to win elected office. And even more, he wanted Joe Jr. to become president someday.
This would give the family a kind of visibility, a kind of cachet, a kind of social status that Joe Kennedy was very hungry for. And the children imbibed this ambition.
While Joe's attention was lavished on his two oldest boys, Robert took his place among the younger children, the girls. He was small, awkward, shy. His father described him as the family runt. He set out to prove that he could be as tough as his brothers. When he was only 4, he jumped off the family boat in a desperate attempt to prove he could swim to shore. As he was going under, his eldest brother had to haul him out. It either showed a lot of guts, Jack said later, or no sense at all.
And that's how Bobby got his father's attention, by being the tough guy. But beneath that toughness, there was always this softness and this sensitivity. He was a mama's boy. In fact, his grandmother worried that he was too much of a sissy, too much of a girly boy, because he clung to his mother's skirts.
Rose Kennedy was a devout Catholic, and Robert absorbed her religious intensity. He made his first communion when he was 7. He became an altar boy, and he attended a school run by Benedictine monks. He grew up with a strong sense of right and wrong. Like his brothers, he was toughened by the demands of his father, but he disguised a gentler nature. Robert Kennedy, a friend said, was truly in touch with his emotions. Within this monster of a family, he was saved by being overlooked. When World War II began, he was in high school. He wanted action, like his two older brothers. He was proud when Jack became a hero, rescuing most of his crew after his PT boat was sliced in two by a Japanese destroyer. But disaster was to follow and determine the direction of his life. In the summer of 1944, Joe Jr. volunteered for a near-suicidal mission to pilot a plane loaded with dynamite toward an enemy target and then parachute to safety. His plane exploded before he ever got there. Joe Jr. was dead, along with all the hopes his father had invested in him. Now it would be up to Jack to realize his father's ambitions, and it would become Robert's role to help him. But he was still young, only 18. In 1948, he graduated from Harvard, went on to law school, and then became the first of the Kennedy boys to settle down. Aged 24, he married Ethel Skakel, wealthy, outgoing, athletic, so serious a Catholic that she had almost become a nun. A year later, the first of his 11 children was born. When it came to those he loved, Bobby was tender, maternal, but he turned a hardened face to the world.
He was particularly edgy and volatile, and I think unhappy when he was in his early 20s. He was an angry young man. I mean, he was always getting into fistfights. I mean, his temper was about that far from the surface.
In 1952, when he managed his brother's victorious run for the Senate, Robert Kennedy gained a reputation as ruthless. He was rude, arrogant, and impatient. But he shrugged off complaints. "I don't care if anyone around here likes me," he said, "as long as they like Jack." Now, with Jack in the Senate, Robert Kennedy stained his reputation further when his father got him a job with a family friend, one of the most hated men in America, red-baiting, lying Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Any man who has been given the honor of being promoted to general and who says, "I will protect another general who protects communists," is not fit to wear that uniform, General.
In 1953, Kennedy enlisted in McCarthy's crusade against the evil of communism in America. He believed in McCarthy.
Robert Kennedy in the 1950s was very much his father's son. His father was fiercely anti-communist. Joe Kennedy saw Joe McCarthy as doing the Lord's work.
History thinks of Joe McCarthy as this virulent red baiter, but Bobby Kennedy was a black and white moralist at this stage of his life. And the communists were the bad guys, and anybody who was against the communists was therefore a good guy. And so he liked the kind of black and white morality that Joe McCarthy was selling.
What was striking about Bobby was not that he worked for Joe McCarthy so much, but rather that he admired Joe McCarthy and became very close to Joe McCarthy. So when McCarthy was conducting his investigations into suspected communists, Bobby enthusiastically joined in this role.
Robert Kennedy worked for McCarthy for 6 months, then moved on, still determined to root out evil in America.
I decline to answer this question on the grounds that the answer may tend to incriminate.
I decline the answer on the ground. The answer I'll be incriminating myself.
Somebody that's been as successful as you can remember how to say, "I decline to answer questions," so don't put that act on.
I want to make sure.
Yeah.
As chief legal counsel for what became known as the Senate Rackets Committee, Kennedy began probing into labor unions and mobsters, grilling some of the toughest gangsters in America. No one offended him more than Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa was president of the Brotherhood of Teamsters, the country's largest, richest, and one of its most corrupt unions. Kennedy said he detected in Hoffa absolute evilness.
You say anything to the effect that the jury treated you very well, and that you thought that you could do very well before a jury.
I know that's pretty ridiculous.
Did you say anything like that?
I did not. And I appeal to the chair that be taken out of the record.
Kennedy made his investigation of Hoffa into a personal cause, holding hearings month after month and calling more than 1,500 witnesses. He wanted to destroy Hoffa.
You've got people in Detroit, at least 15 who have police records. You've got Joey Glimko in Chicago. I say you're not tough enough to get rid of these people then.
Hoffa was contemptuous. He denied any wrongdoing, taunting the young investigator.
Did you say that SOB, "I'll break his back"?
Who?
You.
Say to who?
To anyone.
Figure of speech, I don't even know who I was talking about, and I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, Mr. Hoffa, all I'm trying to find out, I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I'm trying to find out whose back you were going to break.
Figure of speech. Figure of speech.
"I used to love to bug the little bastard," Hoffa said. Kennedy never brought Hoffa down, but his efforts won him the attention of the nation's press, much to the delight of his brother Jack, who was a member of the Senate Rackets Committee too. "Two boyish young men from Boston," wrote a reporter in Look magazine, "have become hot tourist attractions in Washington." The fabulous Kennedy wealth, their marriages, their glamour, all made them favorites of the picture magazines. "I think he found himself during the Hoffa investigation," a friend said. "For the first time in his life, Bobby was happy." But in September 1959, Kennedy resigned from the Senate Rackets Committee where he had made his mark. His brother Jack was running for president. When Jack set out to win the Democratic nomination, Bobby once again put his own ambitions aside. He would do whatever it took to get his brother elected. While Jack rose above the fray, Bobby took on the gritty, day-to-day business of running the campaign, pushing his staffers to their limits, attacking Jack's opponents, becoming the campaign's dark, driving force. As one journalist put it, whenever you see Bobby Kennedy in public with his brother, he looks as though he showed up for a rumble. By the time the Democrats met for their convention in Los Angeles, Kennedy seemed to have the nomination wrapped up. But Lyndon Johnson, the powerful Senate Majority Leader from Texas, set out to stop him.
The person you select is your president. His judgment, the responsibilities he's shouldered, the weight he's carried, the burdens he knows, the decision he makes may well determine whether you live as free men.
LBJ was one of America's most adept political operators, but Bobby outmaneuvered him, skillfully working the convention floor, making sure that LBJ didn't get the votes.
Mr. Chairman, Wyoming's vote will make majority for Senator Kennedy.
John Kennedy was nominated overwhelmingly on the first ballot. Now, all that was left was the choice for vice president. When he chose Lyndon Johnson, he set into motion a sequence of events that left Bobby and LBJ smoldering with resentments that would never go away. From the very first, LBJ and Bobby detested each other. It was, as Johnson politely described it, a matter of chemistry.
It was just oil and water. Bobby was very moralistic. Integrity meant everything to him. And LBJ was a politician.
Robert Kennedy spoke the word politician as if it were an obscenity. He hated the backslapping, log rolling, all of the horse trading of politics, the sort of thing that Lyndon Johnson absolutely loved.
Bobby dislikes Johnson intensely, but Jack Kennedy is calling the shots. And what Jack Kennedy understands is that as a Northeastern Irish Catholic, he needs very much to get Southern votes. And so it becomes essential to bring someone like Lyndon Johnson onto the ticket. But once they let out the word that they're going to make Lyndon Johnson the vice presidential nominee, Labor and liberals in the party throw a fit.
Bobby is charged by his brother with the responsibility of talking Johnson off the ticket.
Robert Kennedy, testing the water, confronted Johnson in his hotel room and told him flatly that JFK no longer wanted him to be the vice presidential nominee. LBJ didn't believe him. Insulted, he refused to quit.
Johnson wants to be vice president. He's not going to back down. He's not going to give up. And he thinks that Bobby is operating without Jack's approval.
Bobby's been out of touch, Jack leaked to a reporter. He doesn't know what's happening.
Bobby is absolutely taking the fall for his brother here, and that suits John Kennedy perfectly well. And Johnson has fallen for this head fake. But it is absolutely inconceivable to anybody who knew the Kennedy brothers that Robert Kennedy would be acting on his own to split up his brother's presidential ticket within hours of the deal being sealed.
And I am grateful, finally, that I can rely in the coming months on many others, on a distinguished running mate who brings unity and strength to our platform and our ticket, Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson will never forgive Robert Kennedy for this. The manner of the selection of Lyndon Johnson as vice president severed the relationship between the two of them permanently, and there would be no turning back. For the rest of his life, Johnson will say that John Kennedy offered me the vice presidency, and in the dark of night, Bobby Kennedy came downstairs to try to take it away from me.
The election of 1960 was too close to call. JFK won by only 120,000 votes. As one Kennedy aide described it, a gnat's eyebrow. Robert Kennedy had driven himself relentlessly. JFK was grateful. He's the hardest worker. He's the greatest organizer, President John Kennedy said. Easily the best man I've ever seen. JFK wanted Robert by his side and appointed his 35-year-old brother Attorney General.
It was a controversial appointment. He had never been a lawyer in a courtroom. And it was nepotism. I mean, he was the brother of the president.
His experience was zero. He'd been a lawyer for Senate committees, a zealot with no understanding of the terrible responsibilities of an attorney general. I was appalled. I thought it was a simply awful idea.
But Robert Kennedy surprised everyone, moving quickly to show he was more than just the president's brother.
There are a number of different areas and where action is needed. I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time.
Within 2 weeks of taking office, he became the first Attorney General ever to declare war on crime. He proved a tireless worker, and his freewheeling style was a striking departure from the formality of bureaucratic Washington.
He was unlike any other attorney general I've known. He wandered around in his shirt sleeves. He had his big, huge dog, Brumus, in his office. The kids came in, the children's drawings were on the wall.
If you saw Bob Kennedy in a tie at his office, it would be way down open. His office was a place of constant motion and doing things unexpected, breaking the schedule. He was not a sit-behind-your-desk man.
But just 3 months after Robert Kennedy had started his new job, he received an urgent summons to the Oval Office. The president was face to face with disaster. JFK had gone along with a CIA plan to invade Cuba with a small army of Cuban exiles. The president had been assured that the Cuban people would rise up against the communist government of Fidel Castro and revolt, but the CIA had been wrong. Robert Kennedy watched helplessly as his brother wrestled with catastrophe. The invaders were under attack. Castro's army was taking prisoners. "They can't do this to you," RFK said. But the invasion failed. Now, the president would turn to his brother for advice and counsel as he never had before.
Traditionally, attorneys general have nothing to do with foreign policy. But after the Bay of Pigs, John Kennedy really wanted Bobby by his side, helping him to make the decisions on everything. Because there was only one person in the world that John Kennedy trusted unequivocally, and that was Robert Kennedy.
I think that brought them much closer together than they had been earlier. There was, I think, a recognition for the first time by Jack on a need for Bobby rather than simply a use of Bobby.
You would think that after the Bay of Pigs, the lesson would be, don't mess with Castro. Bobby's nature, however, was not when the yellow light was blinking to hit the brakes, but rather to hit the gas.
Castro became RFK's obsession. Working closely with the CIA, he launched a secret war against Castro, codenamed Operation Mongoose.
All kinds of things were tried, all kinds. Try to infiltrate the military, have a coup or a revolt, sabotage. He was pushing, always pushing. Bobby Kennedy wanted things blown up, so we blew things up.
Nothing was off limits. Between 1960 and 1965, the CIA made at least 8 separate attempts on Fidel Castro's life. But neither of the Kennedys was ever directly linked to any of them.
The orders I got were get rid of Castro, quote unquote. And I kept asking them, what do you mean by get rid of? Can you be a little bit more specific? What do you want to happen? What do you want to see as an end result? They said, we want him to disappear. And it's left up to you as a senior officer to decide what your limits are, if any.
My own conclusion is that Bobby never quite came out and said, you must kill this guy. You will never find good evidence. They didn't write it down. Joe Kennedy once said to Bobby, never write it down. Old Irish rule in Boston.
RFK attempted to oust Castro for nearly 2 years, but his attempts only seemed to stiffen Cuban resolve.
Total waste of effort. I tried to tell him that at the time. We were not going to succeed. Fidel was going to be there, and he was going to stay there. But Bobby Kennedy didn't understand what his limits were. No matter what we told him, no matter what we tried to do, no matter how many people we put on the job, he was always screaming for more.
By the end of 1961, Robert Kennedy was still only 36 years old and the father of 7 children. After a long day at the Justice Department, he returned home to a Civil War mansion just outside of Washington called Hickory Hill.
It was a household where there was constantly something going on. Bob was overloaded with work, but he always took time for those children.
There was a lot of physical affection. Saturday or Sunday, all the children would pile into my parents' beds and tickle each other, and it was called a tickle tumble. Well, of course, there were plenty of dogs, plenty of horses. My brother Bobby collected, reptiles. We had a coatimundi, hawks, falcons. It was a menagerie.
Hickory Hill was the center of Robert Kennedy's private world. To be invited to a Hickory Hill party signaled acceptance into an exclusive community.
Hickory Hill party was a weird mixture of kind of fraternity party and high-minded salon. And it was kind of a fun mix of both, because they did talk about serious issues. They had Hickory Hill seminars where they would bring in famous people to lecture about child development or juvenile crime or the future of the Cold War. At the same time, they're goofing around and they're playing charades. It was an odd mixture of high sophistication and childish hijinks. There was a childlike quality to Bobby Kennedy. Bobby was always asking what flavor ice cream you like, and his favorite was chocolate.
There were always plenty of games, including Bobby's favorite, touch football.
I really didn't like to play the Kennedy brand of touch football. The rules were crazy. They made up the rules as they went along, or they had their own rules. I played a couple of times, but I'd usually try to find something to do. You know, somebody had to make a phone call, or have to go to the bathroom. They were so competitive with each other, it was no real fun to play.
When all the guests had gone home, Bobby and Ethel assembled their children for an evening ritual.
My mother and my father shared a belief that we are on Earth for a short period of time, and that we are actually children of God. We prayed every night that John Kennedy would be the best president ever, and that my father would be the best attorney general ever.
The Kennedy brothers were now a team. Jack needed his brother, and nowhere more than with a problem that had begun to tear the country apart, the struggle of African Americans for equal rights. In the spring of 1961, a group called the Freedom Riders set out to integrate bus stations across the South. In a little Alabama town called Anniston, an angry mob attacked them, burning their bus, beating them mercilessly.
The Freedom Ride was very dangerous. Just our very being, our very presence was very, very dangerous. During those days, it was impossible for a person of color to get on a bus in the South without being forced to go to the back of the bus or go to a waiting room marked colored waiting, or use restroom facility marked colored men, colored women. We wanted to bring down those signs.
The Freedom Riders were acting on their constitutional rights. Federal statute outlawed segregation in bus terminals used in interstate transportation, and as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy was bound to enforce the law.
I didn't know a great deal about Robert Kennedy. I knew he was a brother of the President of the United States. I knew he was the Attorney General. I wanted him to intervene.
But Robert Kennedy was reluctant. The rage and resistance from white Southerners had taken him by surprise. Before I became Attorney General, he admitted, I won't say I lay awake at night worrying about civil rights.
I think he was slow and late in getting it about the civil rights movement. Robert Kennedy is saying what most of the establishment said in that period, it's a good idea, but it's the wrong time.
I don't think any of us going into the department, despite our views on civil rights, really appreciated how mean it was in the South and how dangerous it was. Bobby used to compare the discrimination against blacks to the No Irish Wanted, and you know that was a wrong comparison. One I think was actually resented by blacks, despite the fact that he meant it well.
They didn't know black people. They didn't know black pain. They were not comfortable with black people. So there was no reason to expect, I can say in retrospect, them to be wise and passionate about this.
The President and the Attorney General both realized that the civil rights issue was the hot rail in American politics. They had won an election by 100,000 votes. They didn't really command a working majority in Congress. It was very narrow on any issue. The Southern Democrats defecting would have meant the loss of any legislative agenda.
As the Freedom Riders traveled deeper into Alabama, Robert Kennedy, fearing more violence, was determined to stop them. Tell them, he told the Special Deputy for Civil Rights, to call it off.
He got on the phone and said, stop those Freedom Riders. The President's about to go to Vienna to meet Khrushchev. It's embarrassing us before the world. Stop it. They were underway. They were not a stoppable group.
Black people in the South had gotten a sense of their efficacy as people and as citizens. And to have Bob Kennedy's Justice Department tell them what to do would have been taking a major step backward. Who are you going to listen to? Are you going to listen to the black people of the South, or are you going to listen to the kid from Massachusetts? Well, that's an easy answer.
Bob was angry that they were upsetting everything by doing this. He wanted the civil rights movement to focus on winning the right to vote, and he didn't like his more stately agenda being upset. But once it was upset, then Bobby went into action.
Desperate to find a way to protect the riders, frantically improvising, Bobby sent his aide John Siegenthaler to meet with Alabama Governor John Patterson.
I go in and sit down and I say, I'm from the Attorney General. These people have to be given safe conduct. He says, we can't protect them. I am telling you, it is impossible. All the people we've got in this state upset about this, I mean, of course people are violent. These people are coming here asking for a fight, and they're going to get a fight.
That evening, we stayed in the waiting room at the Greyhound bus station in Birmingham all night. And we kept hearing rumors that Robert Kennedy was trying to negotiate a way for us to leave Birmingham. He kept saying to people we had a right to travel.
I said, Governor, look, if you can't protect them, we don't have any choice. Either we got to have marshals come in and protect them, or troops come in and protect them. That's the last thing you want. The last thing, when he banged the table, he said, if marshals or troops come into Alabama, blood will run in the streets.
Siegenthaler and Patterson struck a deal. The Freedom Riders would have state protection. As they headed towards the Alabama capital in Montgomery, Kennedy believed that they would be given safe passage.
It was so strange, it was eerie, frightening. It was so quiet, so peaceful. And the moment we arrived at the bus station, the very moment we started down the steps off of that bus, a mob came out of nowhere. And they beat and beat the reporters, and you saw blood everywhere. And then they turned on us. I was sitting ahead by a member of the mob with a wooden crate, and my seatmate was beaten so bad, and I found myself laying in a pool of blood.
And as I pulled up to the bus station, you could hear the screams. I just leaped out of the car, and at that moment they wheeled me around and said, two guys, and said, what do you think you're doing? I said, magic words, get back. I'm with the federal government. And as I turned back, they hit me with a pipe right here.
Robert Kennedy became educated in a real hurry. And I tell you the thing that sealed it for him, perhaps more than anything else, after John Siegenthaler was beaten. Someone that he knew.
I think everything he thought the administration of justice and law enforcement was supposed to be about had been violated, that it was an outrage, that it was a stain on law enforcement to let that happen.
Frustrated by Southern officials, Kennedy ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce the ban on segregation in public transportation.
All of those signs that said white waiting, colored waiting, white men, colored men, white women, colored women, those signs came tumbling down.
He began to understand civil rights in stages. Very few people who are in great positions of power actually go through real interior change. But Robert Kennedy really did change, and that change, I think, began around civil rights.
How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Nevertheless, each one...
On October the 16th, 1962, the president learned that the Soviet Union was deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba, capable of vaporizing American cities along the East Coast within minutes.
It is the most dangerous moment in all human history. Never before had two contending powers possessed between them the technical capacity to blow up the world.
As the president's advisors debated the American response, Bobby's first instinct was to lash out, pressing for airstrikes to destroy the bases, even for an invasion of the island itself.
On the first day, when they discover the missiles, all Bobby wants to do is stage a provocation and bomb Cuba. I mean, he's a complete and total hawk. But this is the significant part. He changes his mind.
After hours and hours of intense debate, RFK began to reconsider. "We've talked for 15 years about the Russians making the first strike against us," he said, "and we never do that. Now, to do that to a small country, it's a hell of a burden to carry."
It's Robert Kennedy who makes the powerful moral argument that to invade Cuba would be to wage a Pearl Harbor in reverse, that America simply didn't do this. We simply didn't wage preemptive attacks. We didn't strike without warning.
This argument didn't carry the day, but it was an important argument, and it started to affect and slow down this rush to war.
I was very much surprised by Bobby's performance. Under Secretary of State George Bull said, "I always had a feeling that Bobby had a much too simplistic position towards things, but he behaved quite differently during the Cuban Missile Crisis." The crisis lasted 13 days until the Russians finally agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a public American pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret promise to withdraw American missiles from Turkey. RFK had hardly slept. He had rarely gone home. An aide who walked into his office remarked, "Something is different in here." RFK replied, "I'm older."
The thing that is hurting us most is the continued existence of segregation and discrimination. And we think we are rendering a great service to our nation. For this is not a struggle for ourselves alone. It is a struggle to save the soul of America.
While the Kennedys were confronting the Soviet Union, the civil rights movement had not gone away. RFK was determined to help, but on his own terms. He was growing increasingly exasperated with the man who was emerging as the movement's most conspicuous and inspiring leader, Martin Luther King.
Tension between King and Bob Kennedy was inevitable. Here was an uncontrollable force, a moral force, a person who was as much his own man as Robert Kennedy was. Bob liked to, control his agenda, and King's business was to, overthrow people's agendas. King, I think, worried about Bobby. He worried that he wasn't morally committed enough. He didn't sense the passion in Bobby. On the other hand, he had great hope that Bobby's readiness to use power would be turned to civil rights. He had hope, but he worried.
On May the 3rd, 1963, King sent non-violent protesters into the streets of Birmingham to boycott the city's segregated businesses. As the Birmingham police used high-pressure hoses to disperse them, RFK watched it all on television. Many of the protesters were children. He was furious, caught between a civil rights movement that refused to back down and the violent antagonism of the South.
That a police chief would set police dogs and fire hoses on people for demanding to be treated fairly in a department store, that was bound to hit at his moral core. The events entirely transformed Robert Kennedy. He started out thinking that it would be better if people would calm down, slow down, and let gradual improvement take place. Bobby learned that you couldn't wait, and that black people were entitled to the most elementary rights now.
That summer, RFK urged his brother to put a civil rights bill before Congress that would put an end to segregation in public accommodations. But the president and his advisors hesitated.
If you put civil rights legislation before Congress, it was going to tie up the Congress for the best part of the next year. And that meant that whatever other programs you had were going to be put on the back burner. But Bobby convinced his brother that not only was it right, but for the first time it was possible. And that the president really has to take leadership on a moral issue.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated.
It was probably the first time in the history of our country that an American president would say that the question of civil rights, the question of race, was a moral issue. And he had the encouragement of Robert Kennedy to push him in this direction. Robert Kennedy was learning. He was growing. He said to me, "John, I now understand. The young people have educated me." And you could see it, you could feel it. And Robert Kennedy during that period became so convinced, not just as a politician, not just as the Attorney General, but as a human being, that it was time for there to be some major steps to end racial discrimination in America.
While RFK increasingly felt sympathy towards the civil rights movement, he authorized a wiretap on Martin Luther King at the request of one of the most powerful figures in Washington. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover hated King, insisted that King was a communist threat, and placed him under close surveillance. RFK acquiesced. If there were communists in the civil rights movement, he wanted to know about it. But there was another reason. RFK was afraid of Hoover, not for himself, but for his brother.
Jack was a promiscuous guy who took great pleasure in having a lot of women around him, and he was careless about this after he became president, almost to the point of recklessness.
Bobby knew that Hoover was a blackmail artist. He knew that Hoover had files on his brother. Hoover had heard that Bobby wanted to fire him, and he wanted to use President Kennedy's sexual habits to essentially blackmail the administration to make sure that he kept his job.
There's no question Bob regretted that he had authorized the wiretapping of King, but Hoover was somebody that everybody was intimidated by.
If Hoover ever released any of the information he had, allowed it to be known, what would happen to the Kennedy presidency?
On November the 20th, 1963, RFK celebrated his 38th birthday at a party at Hickory Hill. The president stopped by to wish him well. He was about to leave for a political trip to Dallas. He said he was looking forward to it. Already the brothers were thinking about the next election and the opportunities a second term would give them. 3 years of intense collaboration had bound them so closely together, each seemed to know what the other was thinking.
No sooner did one of them begin a sentence than the other knew what he was saying. They understood each other so well that they talked in a kind of shorthand.
Well, everybody was having a good time. It was a birthday party, and the president stopped by. The motorcade came up, and he came in and shook hands, and it didn't stay very long, as I remember. Then he was off to Dallas, I guess, the next day.
Robert Kennedy would never see his brother again. On the afternoon of November the 22nd, 1963, Robert Kennedy received a phone call from J. Edgar Hoover. "I have news for you," Hoover said. "The president's been shot." 30 minutes later, the phone rang again. JFK was dead. On November 24th, 1963, while the nation mourned the president, Robert Kennedy grieved for a brother.
It was a physical blow to him, that loss of his brother. An emotional blow, intellectual blow, but it took a physical toll on him. He was physically in pain.
The enormous sadness and ache, it was there all the time. I never knew him when he wasn't in a kind of mourning for President Kennedy.
I was with Bobby, and I talked with him for a while, and it came time to go to bed, so I closed the door and I waited outside, and I heard him just sobbing. And he was saying, "Why? Why, God? Why?"
I think that Bobby found himself bereft, alone, and the inheritor of not only a family ambition, but a national myth. When Jack died, Bobby was truly at a loss. He was deprived not only of a brother he loved, but in a sense of his own identity. Because to be the helper and be the servant and be the henchman could no longer be his identity. He had to forge some kind of identity for himself.
He didn't know who he was, or what he stood for, or what he was capable of. Now, he would have to struggle to create a legacy of his own. It would have been difficult for Robert Kennedy to watch any man take his brother's place, but watching Lyndon Johnson was next to impossible.
All I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today.
The two men now rarely spoke of one another without contempt. Kennedy described Johnson as mean, bitter, vicious. LBJ called him a snot-nosed kid and a grandstanding little runt.
Johnson had particular contempt for the fact that Robert Kennedy had never run for office. He had never been elected to anything, and he saw him as a child of privilege, as someone who had never really earned the offices that he held. Whereas Lyndon Johnson had had to fight for it on his own and earned it in his own right.
LBJ moved quickly to assume the mantle of the fallen president. He convinced the reluctant Robert Kennedy, along with the rest of John Kennedy's cabinet, to stay on, then swiftly began to push JFK's sputtering legislative program through Congress.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
The Kennedy legislative program was sitting on the Hill and not doing much of anything by the time of John Kennedy's assassination. Lyndon Johnson picks it up, infuses it with energy, gives it new meaning and new strength, and drives it through the Congress like only Lyndon Johnson can.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
One might expect Robert Kennedy to be pleased about the success of the Kennedy agenda.
But it was hard to be pleased with what LBJ was doing when it was LBJ doing it and not his brother.
He thinks of Johnson as a usurper. He thinks of Johnson as illegitimate, and it's painful for him to watch Johnson take these pieces of his brother's legacy and take ownership of his brother's legacy. It no longer belongs to his brother. It no longer belongs to him. It belongs to Lyndon Johnson.
While LBJ dominated the nation's politics, Kennedy remained inconsolable. He was a haunted man, forever dwelling on his loss, as if cultivating the pain helped keep his brother's memory alive. He took to wearing his brother's old jacket, although he often forgot it somewhere, as if the jacket was at once a connection to his brother and a kind of burden he desperately wanted to leave behind.
Pain was etched on his face. He told me he couldn't sleep. He'd lost weight. He asked me how he looked. I said, "You look like hell." And he did.
He'd become, as in the Robert Frost poem that his brother also often loved to quote, acquainted with the night.
He and the president's widow often visited John Kennedy's grave, their shared sorrow drawing them closer together. When his faith in the Catholic Church could not alone sustain him, it was Jacqueline Kennedy who suggested he read the tragic dramas of the ancient Greeks. "In agony, learn wisdom," he read in Aeschylus. "Injustice is the nature of things."
Grief humanized him. I think it took him away from a life dedicated to power and will and ambition toward a deeper identification with people who suffered.
Slowly, Bobby emerged from his despair, reconnecting to the everyday world through politics and his need to continue with the legacy of his brother.
Over the past few weeks, many leading members of the Democratic and the Liberal parties here in the state of New York have talked to me about being a candidate for the United States Senate.
On August the 22nd, 1964, still wearing the black tie he had worn since his brother's death, Robert Kennedy announced that for the first time he would run for political office.
I shall resign from the cabinet to campaign for election. I shall devote all of my effort and all whatever talents that I possess to the state of New York. This I pledge.
It is the biggest transition of his life to go from the shadows to the stage. And he had a fear, what if I lose? What if I let my brother down? What if I let my family down? What if I've made the wrong decision? What if I'm not ready to run for the Senate? He was still a wounded animal, half a zombie. He wasn't ready to face the voters.
The former Attorney General of the United States and candidate for the United States Senate from New York, Robert F. Kennedy.
He was still hurting and suffering.
Although voters turned out in large numbers to see him, Bobby found it hard to accept their enthusiasm. "They're cheering him," he said. "They're for him."
He didn't want to trade on being his brother's brother. He didn't think that was right. At the same time, he didn't really have a series of things that I, Robert Kennedy, will do as the senator from the state of New York.
What about this tour of the Fulton Fish Market? What are your impressions?
Well, they have a lot of fish, and
and it just didn't work very well.
I am very pleased and happy to have the opportunity to speak with all of you this morning.
He quickly fell behind in the polls. He was struggling to define himself and what he stood for.
I join Senator Bob Brownstein and Congressman Multa.
He has spoken for his brother on behalf of his brother for most of his political life. Suddenly he's a figure in his own right, but he can really only see himself as fulfilling his brother's legacy, doing what his brother would do if only his brother were still with us.
I think we started something 3.5 years ago. I think it was started January 1961, and I think this election is what we're going to keep it going.
He quoted his brother almost obsessively. had a lot of the hand gestures of his brother.
And it was easy to believe for a minute, and you didn't have to close your eyes to do it, that John Kennedy was still with us.
And if we want to continue that effort, then we have to elect a Democratic administration.
But Robert Kennedy remained at war with himself, his need to emulate his brother battling with his desire to find his own voice.
I think that this election's important, because I think that there's a lot that needs to be done, an intolerable situation, and it has to be changed. If I'm elected to the United States Senate, I intend to fight for that.
Despite the cheering crowds, the election remained too close to call. Much to Kennedy's distress, there was only one man who could help him.
The United States needs a young, dynamic, compassionate, fighting liberal representing New York in the United States Senate, Bob Kennedy.
It had to stick in RFK's craw to have to accept anything from Lyndon Johnson.
Bobby had trouble hiding his distaste, but he was a pragmatist. LBJ may have hated Bobby, but he wanted a Democrat in the Senate. When all the votes were counted, LBJ had helped put Bobby over the top.
For all of us who are elected on this day, all of us now have a responsibility. Our job has just begun.
But even victory could not relieve his melancholy. If my brother was alive, Bobby told a friend, I wouldn't be here. I'd rather have it that way. That night, Bobby called LBJ to thank him for his help.
We got a lot to be thankful for, Bobby, and give our love to Ethel, and let's stay as close together as he'd want us to.
Fine. That'd be fine, Mr. President. Congratulations, though.
Tell all that staff of yours that ain't nobody going to divide us, and I'll tell mine the same way, and we'll move ahead, and I'm proud of you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for your help.
Thank you for calling.
Made a hell of a difference. Thanks.
Bobby Kennedy was never cut out to be a senator. He was used to making things happen, and the Senate's glacial pace irritated him.
He was the second most powerful man in the most powerful country in the world, and now he's a junior senator. He can't even get a seat on the Foreign Relations Committee. He used to run covert actions, and now he can't even go to the hearings. So he is a grumpy, cranky senator who won't sit through long-winded speeches and is disrespectful of other senators. He'll just get up and walk out.
RFK, a friend said, felt impotent, frustrated, floundering. He escaped the Senate chambers as often as he could, channeling his restless energies elsewhere. 2 months after taking his seat in the Senate, he set out to scale a 14,000-foot mountain in Canada, recently named Mount Kennedy after his brother. No one had ever made it to the top before, and Robert Kennedy had never climbed a mountain before.
Bobby hated heights. He was afraid of heights. He didn't train for it, really. I mean, he joked that, as Ethel said, that he trained for it by running up and down the stairs yelling, help.
He was nearly 40 years old. Roped between two experienced climbers, Kennedy forced his way forward, urging the others to increase the pace.
I think Robert Kennedy had a reckless streak in him. He was a ferocious competitor, and with tremendous amount of aggression and will.